Think of a time when you experienced a conversation that left you with a new perspective, or perhaps an inquiry, or you might have felt that something has shifted in you after that conversation. Maybe it helped you gain a new level of clarity, or moved you to take action. That was a coaching conversation. Hello and welcome to the Coaching Conversation podcast. This is your host, Salah El-Leiti, and I'm honored to have with me today Dr. Glenda Eoyang. Glenda helps organizations thrive in the face of overwhelming complexity and uncertainty. She is a pioneer in the field of human systems dynamics, or HSD, which she founded. She also co-authored with Royce Holiday, Adaptive Action, Leveraging Uncertainty in Your Organization. I'm really excited to have you today with me, Glenda. Welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
And we were talking briefly before the recording, and just to give a background for the listeners or people who are going to be watching this, I met you at one of your adaptive action labs or workshops, planning in uncertainty. And I found it very insightful and useful. And again, the introduction to SDI work has been through a couple of mutual connections, Diana Larson and Ahmed Avais. And so I'm glad we were able to connect and make this happen. So my first question is usually around what brought you into this kind of work, this complexity work, the human dynamics. Tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are.
There are lots of origin stories, and I'll tell you the one that's mostly true and useful. How's that? But in the late 1980s, I was running a technical training and documentation company, and we had grown quickly. We used a very strict engineering methodology. In fact, one of the things we taught about was waterfall methods in software development. And at the same time, we became pretty critical of how that was landing. And at first we thought it was just not being well implemented. And then we realized, well, maybe it's more than that. Maybe the paradigm itself is flawed. Mm-hmm. And at about that time, business changed. My clients changed, technology shifted, my staff members shifted. Everything was turbulent for a time. And I realized that my traditional ways of management and leadership, planning, even of instructional design and technical writing, that they weren't fit for the world as it was becoming. And so I kind of took a bit of time off to figure out what was more fit. And I couldn't find anything in the leadership literature, in the management literature, in the organization development literature. Everything was either very strict and structured or too loosey-goosey, mystical, magical leadership as personality. Those two extremes of leadership, are those too familiar to you? Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I guess I'm just going to have to make it up because neither of those is going to work. And because my background in history and philosophy of science, about that time, I began to hear about chaos theory and just really curious about it as a paradigm. So in order to escape thinking about leadership and management and business, I escaped into reading about chaos theory and realized that my business problems followed me. And so what I found in reading about complexity was that each of the principles or patterns or perspectives or ideas that came out of complexity found really useful meaning-making, sense-making in the world that I was working in as a leader. And so I started weaving them together. So since about 1986, 1987, that's what I've been doing, studying the science in so much as I can, seeing what are the patterns that are leveraged in complex systems, and then what it would look like to bring those lessons into decision-making and action-taking in human systems. Mm-hmm. So it was necessity. And it's the same kind of necessity I'm seeing among my clients today. Mm-hmm. They're in the same place and are needing an alternative route to some kind of sustainable success.
I think, that very much aligned with some of the concepts and agile in coaching? How do you respond quickly, but at the same time have to balance those two extremes, like too loosey-goosey versus too rigid and formal, and take a long time to implement? So is that what inspired you to create the Human System Dynamics Institute, or how did that come into the picture?
Good question. So as I was kind of a natural teacher, so I couldn't discover something without sharing it. I felt compelled to write and to teach. And so as I was exploring, things would become more coherent over time. So I wrote a book in 96 that's called Coping with Chaos, 7 Simple Tools. So after I wrote that, this idea about there being useful things in complexity for business, kind of that was satisfied because that book kind of closed that chapter. And then I began to ask questions about self-organizing. So if human systems are self-organizing, if that's really the place where we live and work, then what are the conditions that shape what comes out? So at that time, I was coaching and I was doing a lot of facilitation. And I realized that the facilitated group is a perfect example of self-organizing group. So I knew sometimes I'd do exactly the same things and things would work really nicely. The group would self-organize and be very productive. And sometimes not. Just nothing would happen. And sometimes it would crash and burn. And I couldn't figure out why. So I decided if I was going to do that research, I should get a doctorate. And so I began my research, my dissertation research about the conditions for self-organizing. And that was when I found the CDE, what we now call pattern logic. And that really gave a kind of focal theory base, which was unique to the work that we did. But that's not why we started the Institute. That was your question, right? Why did we start the Institute? When I first started working with complexity in human systems in the late 80s, early 90s, there were lots of people, There were about 10 people who were in the same space, exploring, thinking about, applying the work. So Keith McCandless, whom you've probably heard about, was in that space. Dave Snowden was in that space. Meg Wheatley was in that space. And all of us were doing really interesting, but very different work. And I thought it would be really great to have a place where we could have a dialogue among ourselves to see what could self-organize from the interaction of those 10 people, 10 perspectives, 10 approaches. And that's why I started the Institute, as a way to bring together all these different threads into something that would be coherent and meaningful moving forward. It didn't take me long to realize they weren't very interested in coming into that space. And certainly, why space that I built would they want to come to? So anyway, after a couple of years, so that was in 2001. And so I realized that that wasn't going to really be a pathway that would make sense. And more people were becoming interested in adaptive action and pattern logic and inquiry, which were the 3 things that were kind of braiding our work. And so the purpose of the Institute was to develop theory and practice in human systems dynamics so that we could discover what wisdom there was in complex systems to help us work.
Yeah, I think the work that you're doing, I experienced firsthand with a couple of the workshops in Plain and Uncertainty with adaptive action, and also Create Your Narrative. That's another workshop I attended. It's very, it is simple, but really powerful because, the flexibility of how you can apply it can be applied in many different contexts. And there's a lot of parallels between this work and also some of the practices in Agile. But what's missing usually is this strategy in strategic frameworks that are flexible enough to be implemented and tested quickly, and at the same time, not just go in blindly without having any structure. So that's what I really, like about the framework that you've developed, is how it could be applied in different contexts, and also it's flexible enough to test it as we are building it. So I want to just talk a little bit about that concept of the strategic framework, how you use that to help leaders and organizations see patterns, as you mentioned. Like this idea of patterns is very powerful because I think based on some of my learning, the brain, our brain is like a pattern seeking machine. We always see patterns, but how do you develop something that is already there or bring it to the awareness? So that's one area. And then using that strategic framework, maybe that will help us in that space.
It's a great question. And I should probably say, I don't know how familiar your audience is with complexity, but there are essentially two different ways of thinking about complexity, two different flavors of complexity science. So one of them comes out of communication theory, people like Rosen. And the idea about complexity there is that every situation is unique. And the more unique the individual instance is, the more complex it is. So the most complex thing they can imagine is a string of random numbers. So that's one kind of complexity. The other kind comes out of fractal geometry and computer simulation modeling that says, no, the most complex thing is where you can have something very simple that will generate an infinite number of unique manifestations. Mm-hmm. And it's that second kind of complexity that we work in. So we want to find whatever is the tiniest, most coherent seed that will build coherence wherever it lands. And that's why adaptive action, which is so simple, 3-step iterative process, what, so what, now what, next what, is about as simple as it gets. And as you say, it's not always easy, but it's simple. And the 3 conditions for self-organizing and the idea of standing in inquiry, that those are very simple core practices that as you use them, they evolve and generate sense and action in the world. So they're really two different ways of thinking about complexity. And it's the second, which is the core of HSD. And so as we think about leadership, if you believe that that is true about how things come to be, then the question becomes, what's a leader for? And what's strategy about? And that's the place where the strategic framework comes in. Because what it does is essentially capture the core elements to generate a future that is desired of sustainable success. And so those patterns are going to be different in different industries and different companies at different times with different kinds of leaders. But the strategic framework captures those. What are the smallest elements of action that will generate the future you want to create? So rather than thinking about strategy as a series of step-by-step objective-oriented goals moving toward a place, and then you have multiple ones of those, hundreds of those, each of which is playing itself out towards some given end, we say instead, no, what you need for strategy is some central core that regardless of what happens, it will generate a pattern that's useful. So when we talk about the strategic framework, that's what it is. We began doing strategic framework when one of our longtime clients, a regional, rather large, but regional foundation, the president came to me and said, Glenda, we really have got to be thinking better about the future, but we do not want a strategic plan. We've tried that. It's too big an investment and too little return on that investment. We're not going to do that anymore. But we need something to help us frame our decision-making for the future. And I said, okay, let's call it a strategic framework. What's that going to look like? And so working with them, finding the elements for them in that place and time that would help them make decisions. So no matter where anybody is in the organization, even including their grantees, they can go back to this one set of core principles to make decisions that are meaningful in their place and time, wherever it is. So the strategic framework can include lots of different things. Often there are simple rules, short list of simple rules, like the Boyds for flocks of birds. Often they're interdependent pairs that talk about what are the core tensions that are driving decision making. Often there's some short statement of identity about what the world is to be created. They think of it as a vision, but it's not a vision out there. It's a vision right now. Often it's 3 or 4 kind of key strategic issues or questions that are dealt with. Sometimes it's a statement of history and what's the history that's coming into. So it depends on the industry and the group. But whatever are the tools of decision making, that's what the strategic framework is.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, as you were in the program and learning about the strategic framework, how is it similar to and different from other kinds of strategy development or planning you've done?
I think the biggest difference is the simplicity, as you mentioned. It's and I mean by that it's not an easy thing, but it's simple to understand, and it's focused on three main questions. Obviously, there are supporting things like, as you mentioned, the simple rules, the interdependent pairs, and the paradoxes. But at the same time, it's the simple question around like, what is the problem we're trying to solve, and so what? So what is that gonna help us, or what is it gonna change if we solve this problem? And then now what? So that's really the sort of, it cuts to the essence. It gets to the essence and the core of what we're trying to do, rather than try to build, as you mentioned, a lot of the strategic frameworks or strategy seems to be much more complicated, and it has a lot of like steps, and we have to design these like high level objectives and then break things down into smaller pieces, and that could take a long time. And by the time the strategy is finished and ready to go, things have already changed and it is no longer relevant. So that's the biggest difference, and sort of the value of having this iterative approach to strategy, which I have not really seen a whole lot in that domain until I was introduced to the HSD models and frameworks.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. I don't know of any place else that has that kind of iterative emergent strategy, except people who come out of indigenous leadership models and methods. So there's a wonderful person who wrote Emerging Strategies, whose name has left me at this very moment, but the name of the book is Emerging Strategies. And her work really comes from a very solid indigenous community-based perspective, a kind of story-based narrative world, which is very strong and really wonderful and quite counterculture for the good and great of the Western business world. So that's the place where I've seen things that are related and really important. And yet sometimes the language and the culture of those are difficult to bring into a corporate setting.
Yeah, I think this idea, like the idea of also having sort of simple rules that kind of design this process. Like you said, standing in inquiry is sort of it sounds simple, but it's basically, it can be translated into having curiosity, asking questions, more exploration around the topic that we're trying to create as a group, rather than a lot of times when a group gets together about, talk about, or a team gets together about, talk about strategy or how we're going to move forward, there is a lot of disagreements about how we want to move forward and what we want to do and what's the future going to look like. So having these sort of simple rules that can create the environment or the, sort of the container for the people to operate can help them move forward. I remember, and maybe that's something to elaborate on for the audience here, like the idea of getting stuck in one of those questions. So even though these three questions are simple for the strategic framework, like what, so what, now what, a lot of times people or the groups may get stuck in one of those questions. Like they continue to talk about the what for a long time, and that prevent them from moving on to the next thing, and then the now what, and go through this iterative process as you describe it. So first, what causes that? Like, is there, from your experience, what caused them to be stuck in one of those, the what or the so what or the now what?
Great question. I think there's some fundamental mindsets that get us stuck. We're currently doing a program with Michael Spade and Marie Murtaugh about dragons. And we're exploring some of the fundamental mindsets that keep us stuck. Assumptions that we have about what should be. And because it's not, we don't know what to do. So I think those are what keep us stuck. So if in the what step, we believe that we need to know everything before we move forward, if that's the assumption that we make. And certainly from early in our school days, we learned that. And certainly our professional expertise has told us that we need to know before we do anything. We should know everything about it. Otherwise, we're irresponsible, blah, whatever. So we have that mindset that we have to know everything. Well, in a complex system, you can never know everything. I mean, that's the definition, right? That it's unbounded, high dimension, nonlinear, unpredictable. And so if you think you can't move forward till you know everything, but you can't possibly know everything, then you're stuck, literally stuck, right? And then in the so what step, if you believe that you need the right answer, that with every situation, there's a right answer, and your job is to find it in like an algebra class or in a calculus problem, right? There's a right answer. And if I'm going to get an A, I have to find that answer. It's in the back of the book. And if you look back there, you're going to find it. I have to know what that is. That mindset about that's what expertise is. That's what a good solution is the right answer. Well, in a complex system, there's something that's called equifinality, which is the characteristic of a system that there are many paths to the same point, like climbing a mountain. So the summit is there, but you can take the road around and around, or you can climb up a hill, or you can take the soft walk path or whatever. But there are many ways to get to a point, and that's one of the principal characteristics of a complex system. So what happens if you think you have to find one right answer? You're stuck.
Stuck again, right?
And so you stay in so what, trying to look for the right answer, but there isn't one, so you can't get out of it. And then in now what, people think that whatever they've done before is bound to be right. They've seen other people do it. They've been told it's supposed to work. It's what they're good at. You'll just keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, and then you're stuck. I had someone tell me once, we do a good bit of work in peace and justice efforts. And I realized that almost everybody who works in peace studies teaches. That's what they do. They teach. They don't do other things. They teach. And so I said to somebody once, why is teaching the primary strategy of peace and justice? How's that working for us? And she said, well, it doesn't work so great, but it's all we know to do, so we keep doing it. That's what it looks like to be stuck in now what. And so in every case, it's like holding to be absolutely true things that cannot be possibly true in a complex system. And when you're there, when you're in a complex system and you hold those beliefs, you're stuck. So our job in human systems dynamics and the work we do is to help give people alternative ways to think about and to see things. So in what? How is it possible to know just enough to move forward? In so what? How is it possible to generate 1,000 possible paths and pick one that's cheap and easy and fast for your now what? And in now what? How do you act and at the same time watch the consequences so that you can do your next adaptive action cycle? So building those skills, we call it adaptive capacity, building those skills to be able to navigate. And it's not that you don't get stuck. You still get stuck. I'm living evidence that you can still get stuck, but you don't stay stuck. So you get stuck and you say, oh, I'm stuck. And then you can zoom out and say, what am I assuming that's not true? So you begin to ask yourself questions, and then you can zoom back in and move forward. So it's not that you don't get stuck, you just don't stay stuck.
And I imagine that's part of the framework, part of the process is that you're trying to find the patterns or things that will emerge so that you can iterate on that strategy. Because I imagine most leaders and that I talk to, and maybe that's something that you can shed some light on. Like they're afraid of uncertainty, right? So that's a big part of getting stuck, is that I'm not sure if I do this because it's uncertain if it's going to work. But the only way to be certain or to gain a little bit of confidence is to actually do it and then get some feedback of whether it works or not. So how do you handle that sort of, I guess, dynamic between fear of uncertainty, but still move forward so that you're not stuck?
Yeah, it's a great question. I once had somebody who was working with the CIA ask me, how do you reduce risk in a complex system? We know that if you're in a simple system and you know what the plan is, you've got 100 ways to mitigate risk, to plan it, measure it, respond to it. All of that's very important in complex systems dealt with in a linear way. And so he asked me, so what does risk mitigation look like in a complex system? And I said, adaptive action. And he said, but adaptive action is just standard practice. I said, yes, standard practice and risk mitigation in a complex system also has to be standard practice, that every action needs to be an experiment. And the shorter the experimentation and the more acute you are watching the consequences and the more adept you are at responding to those consequences means that you're living into and out of risk all the time. And the mindset that goes there that gets us stuck is that we think we should know the results before we act. We think it's irresponsible to act without knowing the consequences. But in a complex system, you can't possibly know the consequences. And so it's irresponsible to wait until you know the consequences to act. So that's the trick of being able to move forward, is to see what is possible and then to choose the one that is least risky and least investment, to take that step and then see what happens, and then see what happens, and then see what happens, to build it over time.
Again, I mean, that's not an easy thing, because the default is to know before you act, right? A lot of times that's I think the traditional way, or that the things that, have been learned over time, you gotta know before you act. And at the same time, you have to act to know. So it's sort of a dilemma. But as you mentioned here, if you design the action to be small and design it to be able to get that feedback quickly, that will contribute to that learning cycle and maybe reduce the risk and reduce this anxiety that leaders may have, or all of us do have, when we're about to take an action or step into the unknown or the uncertain and not know what's going to happen. So one of the things that I found really insightful is this idea of simple rules. One of the video that I've seen before, but you also kind of, like, when you show the video of the birds flying and sort of narrated how the simple rules, they follow very simple and not many rules, but these rules can contributed in that self-organizing. How does that play into this idea of the uncertainty and planning and uncertainty?
So for people in your audience who don't know about the simple rules, I just will do a quick intro. Does that make sense? So this was one of the very earliest complex adaptive systems experiments, challenges. So scientists were looking at natural phenomena that organized without any obvious reason or way to organize, self-organizing. And so they watched birds. And so one person decided to try to build a computer simulation model that would flock like birds, where a graphic would represent the birds flocking. And in doing that, what he realized was very short list of rules. If every single entity in the flock was following the same rules, then patterns would emerge for the whole. So locally, each one has a set of rules and local information. And over time, you get systemic patterns that show up like a flock of birds. And for that simulation, the rules were fly toward the center, match the speed of your neighbor, and don't bump into anybody. And each individual could follow those rules. No matter where they were, what their conditions were, they could follow those rules. But if you zoomed out and saw the cluster of them, then there'd be something coherent for the whole. So that's a quick lesson in simple rules. Yeah. And then that really speaks to the power of them in complex human systems. Because what it says is it's possible to set conditions for individuals to be totally free, to adapt to whatever their current conditions are, and still have a whole system that is coherent and productive. Traditionally, we'd think that wasn't true. Either you constrained individual freedom so that you could get systemic coherence, or you allowed individual freedom and gave up systemic coherence. And so simple rules are a way to give you both freedom and systemic coherence. And that really is, I think, the power, and why more and more we're seeing them useful, say, for example, in climate action. So one of the reasons why climate change is such a big problem for us in our modernist way of thinking is that we think we should be able to solve it, that there should be a single solution that should work in all places, and we're going to find it. Well, no. Climate action is going to be different in every locale, in every time, from Tuesday to Wednesday, that variability is cooked into the challenge. And unless we have a way to approach with equal variability, then we're not going to be able to approach it all. But then how do you take action that's going to have global impact if you're having an infinite number of infinite situations of infinite decisions in infinite time? How under the sun can that create something coherent and global? And the only answer we've been able to find is simple rules. Now, what they are, that's the question. But if everybody in the world, if every human being in the world, wherever they were, whatever they were doing, whatever resources they had, however much power they had, if we could all follow a short list of simple rules, and by short, it's fewer than 6 simple rules, it would be possible for us to create a systemic pattern that is sustainable, that reduces CO2, that allows us to live in wherever we are, that allows us to share resources. I don't know what those rules are. We're working on a variety of projects trying to find a set of rules that can be that robust and large scale. But that's why it's so urgent right now and why it's such a powerful tool, because it unlocks that major constraint for our collective future, I believe.
I mean, that's a great example, because, even if we apply it at the organization level, a lot of times leaders are looking for either, every time something happens, there's more rules and more policies and more the things that they have to introduce to the system, thinking that this is going to solve problems, but it creates more problems. So that's one end of the spectrum, as you mentioned. And then the other end of the spectrum is like, there's no rules and it's chaos and everybody does what they want. And that also not very helpful.
That's right.
So yeah, finding that sweet spot or the balance between too many rules and sort of the rigidity of that it creates for a system, a complex system, and no rules, and that also creates its own set of problems. So simple rules can be that in between or the balance. How has, I guess for your working with leaders and organization, what is the starting point to create these simple rules, or is there a starting point to get to that, simple rules that can be helpful to the system?
Yes. The first question is, do you want to understand the simple rules that have been in place that are driving patterns today? Because sometimes for leaders, that's a really good thing to do, just to come to that kind of understanding about what are the underlying rules for the phenomenon we see. And sometimes you say, we want to create a pattern in the future. So that's the first thing, is to decide whether you want to understand the current or set conditions for something future. Ultimately, they come together, but at the beginning, they need to be separate. So if you want to understand the rules currently that are giving you the patterns that you have, you ask folks, what's it like to work around here? What are the patterns you see? When you make decisions, what are the things you consider? When you talk with other people, when you came into the organization, what surprised you? And then you begin to get a list of what it's like to be around here. So those are the patterns. And then you can say, well, what are the guides to behavior that generate those patterns? So I can give you a quick example. So we were working with a large supercomputer company about the time we were beginning to work seriously with the simple rules. Dates me a little bit to be talking about supercomputer company. But anyway, they were trying to go from doing hardware development to doing software development. And they realized they just were failing time and time and time again. And so they asked us to look at, see what was going on. And so we said, well, what are the patterns that we're seeing? What does it mean to work at this organization? And so as we interviewed people, this thing came up. We're all stars. They were hardware developers who created the fastest, best, whatever computer. And so to work there was to be a star. And this showed up in the food they had in the cafeteria and the way their offices were designed and what their titles were and all of it. Everybody, if you worked there, you were a star. So that was the pattern we saw. So we started asking, what are the rules that create stardom? And they were things like, don't say anything until you're certain. Stand on your own 2 feet. See yourself as a creator. Don't collaborate with other people. All of those were the rules that gave them the star behavior. Well, imagine what happens when you take those rules and move them into software development. It didn't work. obviously, right?
Right.
So you needed a totally different set of rules to do software development. And so that was what we spoke with about them. They ended up splitting the company and sending one group of collaborative software developers off so that they didn't lose the power of the stardom in hardware development. But that's an example of looking at what is, asking yourself, what are the processes that are creating it? What are the decisions that people are making? What are the actions that everybody's taking wherever they are that create that pattern? That's retrospective. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of the rules that I've seen, and then those are not like rules that you find in a book, in the company or in the company's SharePoint or site website or whatever. Those are rules that you get by asking questions and collecting these stories from people. But some of the rules that are written, for example, like if I were to think of Agile, for example, Agile has 4 values, and some of the focus in the past has been processes and tools, right? So that's the focus, is that, we value process and we value tools. And then when Agile values came about, the focus was more on individuals and interaction. So, depending on where you focus, whether you're more on the process and tools or individual interactions, that will impact how you work with others and collaborate or just not collaborate. Like, don't collaborate with anybody. That's an unwritten
Is that a
rule.
great rule?
Right.
Yeah, often the simple rules are unwritten rules, and often people don't want to talk about them and can't. And it's interesting to think about the different kind of flavors or approaches in Agile and what simple rules would be common across those and what would not be common across them. That's a really interesting question. We also find simple rules to be incredibly helpful in coaching. In fact, my colleague Royce Holliday and another colleague, Mallory Titel, wrote a book about using simple rules for development of self. And it's a lovely book about how you go about thinking about your own values, what's important to you, what your identity is, how you want to be in the world, and then how do you distill that down to a set of simple rules that then you can use for decision making and action taking and connection. Yeah, it's a great little book. And then as a coach, if you can help your clients build a set of simple rules, then it holds them accountable to something they've defined. So they can say, these are the rules I want to follow. This is the world I want to create. So as a coach, you can ask them, how are you doing? Are you following those rules? Are they creating the pattern that you want? So it becomes a whole core of coaching structure as well. We have in the past done an adaptive action lab on coaching and are currently writing a new program, not to replace other coaching disciplines, because they're all really, really powerful, but to say, if you're coaching at the edge of complexity, what does that look like? And what are tools that will help you step from a kind of orderly, predictable world into one of uncertainty with your clients?
Yeah, I remember I noted down the 4 rules I remember from HSD work that turn judgment to curiosity, turn disagreement into shared exploration, and then turn defensiveness into self-reflection, turn assumptions into questions. So that's sort of if we're able to create rules like this with coaching and in organizations with teams, then we can start to shift our focus, because a lot of time that defensiveness just happened, but then we have to look at these rules to recalibrate. And am I getting defensive about something that is happening with the group? And instead, maybe I should be looking at exploring, why am I getting defensive about this? Maybe it's important to me, or maybe a value that I hold dearly was stepped on, or something that caused that sort of defensiveness. So it's very, the idea of simple rules sounds simple, but it's very, it's very powerful. I think it could help a lot of leaders, whether it's in a coaching context or working with groups in their team in general, to find out what makes the group tick, and what are the patterns that they're seeing. Like, again, back to the idea of like patterns, and finding those patterns can help shift the conversation and eventually the culture of the whole organization to be more adaptive.
Imagine what a retrospective would be that used those 4 questions, those 4 rules for inquiry. Be a really different kind of retrospective, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a video that I did that's called Peace as a Pattern. And it talks about the rules that are developed, say, for street gangs, that there are rules that they follow that build street gangly behavior. And how can you then, once you see the rules, what can you do to make just a tiny shift in them? Because it's really hard to take somebody out of there and give them a whole different set of rules, or to take a whole system and say, no, you shouldn't behave that way. You should follow these rules. But if you say instead, let's reinterpret one of these rules and see how it shifts the pattern that's generated. And so there are lots of things you can do once you're aware of the rules that are generating the pattern. That's your what. And the so what then becomes, what's the tiniest change that we can make in those rules that will shift the pattern? And then the now what is, let's shift that and see what happens.
So that's a good way to sort of look at the next, like, now what? Now that we've discussed a lot of, these concepts, like there's strategic framework, there's adaptive action, there's the questions and the simple rules, and now what? What do people, how do people get to start this, or what do they do next?
That's a great question. Thank you. So we believe that theory and practice come together. So you're welcome to read our books, and that's great. Leveraging Uncertainty is I think a really great book. And so you can read, but that won't get you as far as reading and practicing. And reading and practicing by yourself won't get you as far as reading and practicing in community. And so the most important place to start is joining a community of inquiry. And there are 3 ways you can do that pretty simply. So one is we have a daily activity, 10 o'clock Central Time US, which is called Inquiry is the Answer. And it's 30 minutes long. And people come together in a Zoom space. Someone shares a wicked issue in just a really short description. Then they go silent and listen to questions. And we ask them questions that are open-ended, that stretch their brains. This is the so what? But they just listen to about 15 minutes of questions from all different kinds of things. And then a few minutes at the end, they say what they saw, what they learned, what they're going to do. That we've been doing that Monday through Friday, every day, 30 minutes. We close at 10:30 always. And that is a totally open time. And so to come and visit us in that space would be great. Also, we're at session like 852 or something. We started in the middle of March 2020 as a response to COVID. And so all of those have been recorded and they're on our website. And so you can see them, you can hear them, you can look at the chat that includes all the questions, you can see what the wicked issues are. So that's a really good place to start. The second thing is that we have monthly live virtual workshops where for an hour we take a topic or an application, we talk about it. It's really the most lecture type program we do. But it's free. And those are also all recorded, all up on the website, all free for use. So that's a second thing on a monthly basis. The third thing is that we offer short courses, the adaptive action labs that you went to. And the idea is that you bring your own wicked issue, whether it's in planning or whether it's in narrative or whether it's in coaching or in coaching. Those are 2-3 hour sessions, couple of days apart, so you have time to practice in the middle. They're not very expensive, and there are lots of different topics, and we do a different topic every month. And so it would be great for you to join those. And when you're ready to take the deep dive, we have certification training that is essentially 5 days, either face-to-face or online, and then 4 months of practice where you have small group, large group. You do your own adaptive action experiments. You learn and practice lots of different tools for 4 months. So that's the certification training. That's kind of the deep dive. And there's a community of 1,000 associates around the world who are constantly learning and growing themselves. This is an open system. We are never done. It is itself a complex adaptive system. And so to join in that community, and you are part of that community, you're asking lovely questions, practicing what you know and wondering about what you don't. And so to join that community is really the best now what, in whatever way you can. And great thanks to Diana and to Ahmed about bringing you into this conversation, and to you for continuing it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I am trying to practice the stand-in inquiry and be curious about these things. And I appreciate your generosity with your time and wisdom. I know there's a lot of information on the website, hsdinstitute.org. org. So if people go there, there is a lot of material, and you have really been generous with the material as well. So you ask people to give credit, but they could use it and practice these concepts. But again, I mean, it does help to be practicing with a group, with a community, so that you can get this sort of rich feedback and just see things from different perspectives. And apply.
It is like learning to ride a bicycle, that you don't wait until you're an expert to get on the bicycle. Or you'll never become an expert. What you do is try a little bit. So whatever you know, even whatever you heard and learned today, whatever you know, practice it. See what happens. You'll build your muscles as you practice. And so, and it's fun.
Yeah, it is definitely the strategic framework, or the three questions have been really something that I use often to clarify my thinking, and also, in my coaching work as well, the what, the so what, the now what. It's interesting because the first time I was introduced to do three questions were used in a retrospective. I believe it was something probably from Diana in one of her books or retrospective formats that I tried several times. But the context of where it came from and the strategic framework and how to apply it in this context has been a lot more rich and insightful. So yeah, I appreciate your time. Any final words or anything that you would like to share before we end?
Let me see. I think just thank you. Thank you for being such an explicit learner and sharer with this community. It just is really exciting that you're teaching and learning in your own curiosity. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. And I know we didn't get to talk about a few other things like radical uncertainty, but I hope we can do a part 2 at some point. So thanks again for your time. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. Take good care.
You too. Hey, thank you for listening. I hope this conversation gave you something to think about or take action on. Remember, take action and get clarity, then repeat.